Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are dialing in from today. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation to mark the 50th anniversary of Cyclone Tracy. My name is Margaret Moreton. I'm the Executive Director at the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, and I am delighted to be your host today. I would like to start by acknowledging that I'm hosting this event from the lands of the Wurundjeri people here in Naarm. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands from which you're all joining us today, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in today's event. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and I celebrate the diversity of the Aboriginal peoples across this country and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and the waters. I would especially like to acknowledge today the Larrakia people, who are the traditional custodians of the area of Darwin and its surrounding areas. And I would like to acknowledge the many thousands of people who were impacted by Cyclone Tracy, the residents, the families who woke early on Christmas morning 50 years ago to a very different world, to the many rescue workers, volunteers, humanitarian agencies, military and civil defence personnel, and strangers from all over the nation who provided accommodation and support to the surge of people being evacuated from Darwin. All of this being coordinated in an era where there were no mobile phones, no computers, but a great deal of goodwill. We pay our respects to those people who lost their lives and to their families, and to the many people who were injured and displaced by what continues to be known as one of Australia's worst disasters. So today I would like to thank the Northern Territory Emergency Services and the Australian Red Cross for participating with us today and partnering to mark this 50-year anniversary. I will introduce our speakers shortly, but before I do, some housekeeping. I can see a number of you are using the chat to say hello and recognise the lands upon which you sit or stand as you join us, and please continue to do that. Today's event will include images, video, memories and reflections about a traumatic and devastating event. So I need to just remind us all that this may trigger our own memories, our own emotions and feelings, and we may be potentially uncomfortable or surprised by our emotional response to today's event. It's important to me to ask you all to just monitor how you're going throughout the event and manage your own exposure. Tears are a normal human response, so we can't see you. If you shed tears, I may do so as well, but do whatever you need to do to support yourself and anyone else who's there with you. Today's event will be recorded, which is our practice, and made available along with the slides after the event. We are using the Q&A function as well as the chat, and we'll use the Q&A function to have a look at some questions if you want to post them throughout the seminar. So please put them in that window. Just use the chat to say hi. We will use the chat as well to put in some information for you. You may want to share your thoughts and reflections during the presentations in that chat. Make sure you use the drop-down menu of all panelists and attendees so that we can all benefit from one another's reflections. And I would ask you, as I always do, to just be respectful of one another and of our speakers when posting your comments or when asking your questions. Today we'll be hearing from Andrew Coghlan from the Australian Red Cross, from Ian Carlton from the Northern Territory Emergency Services, and from Richard Creswick, author of the recently published collection of people's experiences of Cyclone Tracy, called Tracy, 50 Years, 50 Stories. So before we do any of that, I would like to introduce a video that we'd like to play for you first. It's a little bit grainy because it's old, but it's just a lovely capture of Cyclone Tracy. So I'll pass over to our wonderful tech people for the video.
A cyclone has a sound, and it's not merely the sound of wind or the odd thump of something hitting the house, is perhaps the most terrifying sound 40,000 Australians have ever heard. The sound of literally millions of sheets of corrugated iron being scraped across the ground at 200 miles an hour to thump into rather flimsily built fibreboard buildings. And this is where the damage was caused. I was instantly reminded, and other people have been too, of the similarity to the first shots of atom bomb attacks on the two cities in Japan. Later in the day, we checked out the worst area, the devastated northern suburbs. Here, houses had literally exploded off their piers. People had been left sitting on bare floorboards or in the concrete storage sheds under the piers, or worse still, were trapped. One big worry about Cyclone Tracy was that we felt that the people down south didn't know that we were in trouble, that they were enjoying Christmas quite unaware that we'd been wiped out. It wasn't until late in the afternoon we managed to get the first story through, and this was by using ship's radio and contacting Perth for the story to be sent through. It took almost 4 hours to establish radio contact with Perth.
It was late on Christmas Day before the rest of the nation realised the magnitude of the disaster. The armed services responded immediately on orders from the Natural Disasters Organisation. Its chief, Major General Stretton, flew to Darwin to take charge. The Air Force began a massive airlift. The Army flew in engineers and signallers, and in Sydney, the Navy readied for sea. The immediate aim was to ensure that Darwin had the basic requirements for survival. Emergency supplies were taken in by air, and within 2 days, more were on the way in 10 ships of the Australian Navy: the flagship Melbourne, the Stuart, Brisbane, Stalwart, Supply, Vendetta, Hobart, Flinders, and the landing craft Balikpapan and Botano. The British submarine Odin also set out for Darwin for use as a floating powerhouse. At the same time, Army supplies, including medical equipment and food, were being prepared for air freighting to Darwin.
At this stage, it was help yourself to whatever relief was available, and this was generally done in the most responsible way. In fact, the large emergency centres established at places like Casuarina High School were set up by private citizens actually entering the high schools and opening them up so they could become refugee camps.
What happened to Darwin on Christmas morning has never happened in Australia before. Darwin is devastated. Darwin is destroyed. Darwin looks like a battlefield or a Hiroshima. The people of Darwin have been magnificent through it all. To come to the aid of Darwin is our greatest national challenge for 30 years.
The Prime Minister, Mr. Whitlam, interrupted his overseas tour to visit Darwin.
My mind inevitably went back to the early 1940s when I first saw this city, not very long after it had been bombed by the Japanese. And it's heartbreaking to see that all the effort that's been made over a whole generation to house people in this city has been destroyed last Christmas, because there's no more people can live in Darwin in present conditions than were able to live there during the war. And the people who live in Darwin now enjoy no better conditions than they did during the war. Now, the great thing I have to say to the people of Darwin is that the Australian government is determined to see that Darwin is rebuilt and restored, and the citizens of Darwin are rehabilitated and returned.
Friends and relatives waited for hours at southern airports. But before leaving on the flight south, many of the refugees had waited several days for notification of their departure details. Some had only the clothes they wore. Some had left Darwin without being able to say goodbye to fathers and husbands. But at all the southern airports, as here at Adelaide, everyone tried to give them some comfort. There was an overwhelming nationwide urge to help. Appeals for food and clothing met with such a generous response that some voluntary organisations had trouble coping with it all.
So much to respond to in that video. So we'll move on though. I'd like to introduce Andrew Coghlan. We will use the chat window to put in the various CVs of our speakers to save a little bit of listening to me. But Andrew is the head of Humanitarian Diplomacy Emergency Services at the Australian Red Cross. Now, unfortunately, Andrew hasn't been able to join us today in person, but we have a pre-recorded message which we'll play now.
For the opportunity to be joining in this really important webinar. Apologies, I can't be there live today, but hopefully the pre-record will still be of interest and significance to people. My name's Andrew Coghlan and I come from the Australian Red Cross, where I work in the Emergency Services Program. Next slide, please. First up, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. People obviously joining from a variety of different places. In my case, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Coghlan Nation, and also paying particular respects to any First Nations peoples who might be on the call today. It's also important to note, I think, that with all the attention on the 50th anniversary of Cyclone Tracy, it may well be a challenging time for a number of people as long-held memories and experiences resurface. So please be aware of that and look after yourselves where you need to. Next slide, please. In August of this year, Australian Red Cross marked and celebrated 110 years working in Australia. A key focus of the organisation's efforts throughout that 110 years has been to mobilise volunteer support for people impacted by emergencies and disasters. Obviously, a number of major disasters have been significant over that time in terms of their community impact in particular, but also on the way in which the emergency management system supports people who have been involved. Coincidentally, two of these significant disasters reached major milestones this year, with 50 years having passed since Cyclone Tracy and 20 years since the Indian Ocean tsunami. Next slide, please. The impact of Cyclone Tracy and the numbers as we now know them, particularly in terms of the loss of life and the numbers of homeless and evacuees, really speak for themselves. In many ways, it could be argued that Cyclone Tracy and its aftermath have also shaped much of what emergency management has looked like over the last 50 years, providing the bedrock on which our arrangements are built. From a Red Cross perspective, our volunteers are still providing many of the same sort of support services after disasters to this day, albeit in a far more developed and sophisticated way. Next slide, please. I'd like to explore a few of the areas in relation to Cyclone Tracy in a bit more detail. Firstly, to registration and relief. As part of Red Cross's role as auxiliary to government, the Commonwealth called upon us very early to provide humanitarian support, something that we obviously continue to do globally. The scale of the devastation of Tracy meant that Darwin was largely unlivable and people had to be transported out of town into longer-term temporary accommodation facilities. Initially, this was women and children only, with the men left behind to help deal with the aftermath and clean up, something that I'm sure would be somewhat different should something similar happen today. Bearing in mind that also in 1974, communications were fairly rudimentary and limited to phones in people's homes. No such thing as mobiles, obviously, back in those days, or text messages. It was critical, therefore, to track who was evacuated and where they went to, so as families could be reconnected at the appropriate time. Red Cross volunteers worked with Defence personnel, setting up a registration process using paper cards and pencils to record very basic details of who'd been impacted and where they were going to. This provided a really important tool to reunite people once they'd been relocated. Some of the activities that took place were when pilots were refuelling planes, our teams would be on the runways handing them envelopes with lists to take back to a staging point that was set up in Adelaide. These registrations were also the first indication to the rest of the country that there was a huge exodus of evacuees heading south. In conjunction with police, roadblocks were put in place at places like Yarrawonga on the New South Wales-Victorian border, where a lot of people were driving south, to register people travelling by car 24 hours a day until the 31st of December in 1974. Our volunteers also provided assistance to evacuees at a variety of locations, including both airports and bus terminals, as people moved around the country fairly freely. Our volunteers also set up a hotline to enable anxious relatives and friends to get in contact and track the whereabouts of their loved ones. In addition, Red Cross volunteers worked tirelessly to provide relief supplies, drawing on community goodwill, with the outpouring of community concern and generosity, another phenomenon that continues to this very day. Next slide, please. Given the impact of the cyclone, blood supplies were also in high demand. So transfusion and first aid services were also established alongside the Darwin Hospital. Support was needed not only in Darwin, but across the country, given the scale of the cyclone and the relocation of the evacuees. This saw Red Cross volunteers pull together nationwide, helping with relief, temporary accommodation, and psychological first aid in a wide range of settings. Next slide, please. Nearly 50 years on, the impact of Cyclone Tracy continues to this day. In many ways, it was virtually the birth of Australia's emergency management arrangements, or at least the modern version of them, providing the basis that's been built on, developed and refined ever since. From a Red Cross perspective, a number of things really stand out and provide the bedrock of what we do. Tracy was a very early example of the benefits of a national approach to disasters of this scale, highlighting the unique benefit of drawing on teams from across the country in a very unified way. The registration process has grown from paper and pencil on airport runways to initially become known as the National Registration and Inquiry System, and more recently, since the Black Saturday fires in Victoria in 2009, it's morphed into the more technology-based Register, Find, Reunite system. And in many ways, the support provided by volunteers was the forerunner to the delivery of more sophisticated psychological first aid and psychosocial support, which volunteers and staff from Red Cross and a range of other organisations have built on and continue in the current day. Next slide, please. So 50 years on, it's obviously been really important to reflect on Cyclone Tracy. It's particularly timely as two key reviews of Australia's emergency management arrangements are being discussed, and the threat and impact of disasters is increasing through climate change and other threats. Interestingly, some of the most pressing issues observed during Tracy included things like communications, donated goods, volunteer management, large-scale temporary accommodation, and registration for relief and recovery services. Whilst we like to think that with various technological and other advances, a situation where a whole capital city would be wiped out in the future is highly unlikely, it's worth reflecting and thinking about how current and future arrangements would be able to cope with something of such scale. Thank you.
I can only hope that you are right, Andrew, and that we won't face an event where an entire city is wiped out. Perhaps time will tell. Look, in Andrew's absence, I would like to thank him for putting that together. He was very hopeful to be here today, but it wasn't possible. So with that, I'll thank him and thank him in person next week. And now I'd like to introduce Ian Carlton from the Northern Territory Emergency Services. It's important to have a perspective from the NT. So Ian, over to you.
Thank you, Margaret, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone attending. I'm coming to you today from around the country in Alice Springs. So the tropical Cyclone Tracy event, the northern Australian city of Darwin, as we've just seen, was devastated early on Christmas morning 1974 when it was hit by Tropical Cyclone or tropical weather depression that was given the name Tropical Cyclone Tracy. As the eye of the cyclone passed over the city between midnight and 7 a.m. on Christmas morning, torrential rain fell, and the winds were officially recorded at 217 kilometres per hour prior to the Bureau of Meteorology anemometer being destroyed. Houses and other buildings disintegrated under the onslaught, accompanied by the sounds of flying debris and breaking glass, as we heard in the video. Records have identified 66 names of individuals who perished as a result of the cyclone. 53 of those were on land and 13 at sea, and many more were injured. 70% of Darwin's homes were destroyed or suffered severe damage, and all public services, communications, power, water and sewerage were severed. As we've heard, Major General Alan Stretton, Director General of the Natural Disasters Organisation, was placed in charge of the rescue effort. Emergency committees were established to deal with such matters: accommodation, clean-up, clothing, communications, evacuation, food, law and order, sanitation, and health and social welfare. Tropical Cyclone Tracy was the largest single evacuation in Australian history, with more than 30,000 people leaving Darwin. The Defence Forces played a major role in cleaning up the city and suburbs, with essential services all severed, with food and shelter at a premium. Many Darwin people were evacuated, and in the week that followed, Darwin's population was reduced to a little more than 10,000 people. The total damage bill in the 1970s ran into hundreds of millions of dollars, which would equate to billions of dollars today. For the next 6 months, access to the city was regulated by means of a permit system, and the Darwin Reconstruction Commission was established on the 28th of February 1975 by the Darwin Reconstruction Act to plan, coordinate and undertake the rebuilding of Darwin. Between 1975 and 1978, the Commission coordinated many construction projects, including the building or repair of more than 2,500 homes. As we've heard, national emergency management arrangements were instigated after this. The National Disaster Organisation within the Department of Defence was established in August 74, just prior to Tropical Cyclone Tracy, headed up by Major General Alan Stretton and 5 other Director Generals after him until 1992, when the next iteration of the National Disaster Organisation Emergency Management Australia was formed. This year marks the 50 years since the Australian Government established a National Emergency Management Organisation, today referred to as NEMA. NEMA coordinate national efforts across the emergency management continuum, working year-round to improve Australia's emergency management capabilities, reduce disaster risk and support our communities. Tropical Cyclone Tracy had national impacts for all future emergency management processes, including the development of wind terrain code, the strengthening of Commonwealth responses to disasters, and the setting up of the National Registration Inquiry System, which is nowadays known as Register Find Reunite, and run wonderfully by Police and Red Cross, as we've heard from Andrew. So a bit of history about the Northern Territory emergency management arrangements. In common with its sister services throughout Australia, the Northern Territory Emergency Service was born out of the need to create civil defence capability during the Second World War. With the creation of Commonwealth Natural Disasters Organisation in June 1974, the responsibility for civil defence and emergency service was devolved to the states and territories. In the transition of the official birth date of Northern Territory Emergency Service, which is set for the 1st of January 1975, with Mr. Wilson appointed to be Executive Officer. The intervention of severe Tropical Cyclone Tracy on the 25th of December 1974 gave the new service a baptism of fire, which had significant bearing on the subsequent development of both Northern Territory Emergency Service and the broader counter-disaster organisation throughout the Northern Territory. The Legislative Assembly of the Northern Territory passed the Cyclone Disaster Emergency Ordinance, which, when assented to the 9th of January 1975, gave the Director of the Northern Territory Emergency Service, Mr. Ray McHenry, extraordinary powers to control post-Tracy counter-disaster operation. A permanent divisional officer for the southern region of the Northern Territory was also appointed. So with that, we're now coming to the current Territory Emergency Management arrangements. So the Northern Territory Emergency Service was previously governed by the Disasters Act 2008 until November 2013, when the Emergency Management Act 2013 was passed by the Legislative Assembly. The Northern Territory Emergency Management Act 2013 reflects on an all-hazards approach to the management of emergencies, natural or otherwise, and provides the legislative authority for all 4 phases of emergency management, being prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery. The Act provides for the adoption of measures necessary for the protection and preservation of human life and property from the effects of large-scale emergency events. It forms a legislative authority for emergency management activities and defines the Northern Territory's emergency management structure and assigns roles and responsibilities across all levels of government. The Minister for Fire and Emergency Services is the responsible minister for the Act. The Act identifies key emergency management positions, outlining their functions and powers. These positions reflect governance arrangements shared by the Northern Territory Police Force and the Northern Territory Emergency Services in the response phase and the Chief Minister and Cabinet in the recovery phase. The Territory Plan describes the Northern Territory's approach to emergency and recovery operations, the governance and coordination arrangements, and the roles and responsibilities of agencies. The Commissioner of Police is the Territory Emergency Controller, and he or she is responsible for controlling and directing emergency operations within the Northern Territory. Now a little bit about the Northern Territory Emergency Service. The Northern Territory Emergency Service is responsible for facilitating emergency management planning, raising public awareness of potential disasters, providing a response capability for emergency events through dedicated volunteers. The Northern Territory Emergency Service, like many others around Australia, however, with the Northern Territory Emergency Service, we're a part of the Northern Territory Fire and Emergency Services. However, as the service is mostly volunteer-based, it is also affiliated with the Australia-wide State Emergency Service. The Northern Territory Emergency Service is led by our Chief Officer, Fleur O'Connor, and encompasses 2 arms: emergency management and operations. As you've seen, cyclones within the Northern Territory and the northern part of Australia, we're not immune to them, and we've had a few. However, tropical cyclones are identified as one of the major risks for the Northern Territory. The entire Northern Territory coastline has been impacted by numerous tropical cyclones over recorded history, which has resulted in billions of dollars of damage. The ability to manage the response to a tropical cyclone can be both complex and challenging, especially as there can be consequences before, during, and after the tropical cyclone has passed through. On average, 3 tropical cyclones occur during each season over the warm ocean waters of the Northern Territory, and on average, 2 tropical cyclones across the coastline. Some of our cyclones that we've had: February 2015, severe tropical cyclone Lam crossed the mainland coast around 2 a.m. Central Standard Time on Friday, the 20th of February, as a Category 4 severe tropical cyclone, about 15 kilometres northeast of Ramangini and 20 kilometres southeast of Norgimbi. At the time of landfall, the estimated mean winds were 185 kilometres per hour, with gusts reaching 260 kilometres per hour. There was damage to a number of homes on Elcho Island and power and water outages to the island as well as Ramangini. It was noted the most significant damage was caused to coastlines and vegetation rather than to the communities of Gallawinku, Norgimbi and Ramangini, with no serious injuries reported apart from the death of a dog. The damage bill at the time was reported to be more than $100 million, which equates to a greater than $120 million today. March 2018, tropical cyclone Marcus was small in size, but it caused widespread and significant impacts over the Darwin area, and it was recorded as the most destructive storm to hit Darwin since severe tropical cyclone Tracy. Thousands of trees were damaged or brought down. Many trees fell on buildings and cars, and around 430 power lines were down, leaving some 26,500 properties without power immediately after the tropical cyclone. Approximately 50% of these customers had their power restored within 2 days, and more than 90% within 3 days. Thousands of residents were left with no drinkable water for several hours, and precautionary boil water alert was issued initially. Fortunately, there were no injuries. The strongest wind gusts were recorded at this time was 70 knots or 130 kilometres an hour on the 17th of March, with the automatic weather station located at Darwin Harbour. The repair bill for tropical cyclone Marcus market was estimated at almost $98 billion. So as you can see, and as you'll hear from Richard shortly, tropical cyclones within the Northern Territory, and as I said earlier, across the top end, can cause a lot of damage. And celebrating the 50-year anniversary since Tropical Cyclone Tracy, I applaud the responders back there in those days, and I look forward to hearing more from Richard. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian, and thank you for filling in for Fleur, who withdrew at the last. Appreciate your willingness to step into the breach. So our final speaker today is Richard Creswick, and I'm really looking forward to this because I've had the pleasure of listening to Richard speak about his experiences before, and I'm delighted to welcome him to today's seminar. As we said earlier, Richard is the author of a book that shares the stories of people who experienced Cyclone Tracy. The book is called Tracy, 50 Years, 50 Stories. I recommend it. I'm partway through it myself. It's a read and a ride. So Richard, over to you. Welcome very much to our seminar, and I'll hand the speaking stick to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret, and lovely to see you again. Nice to meet you at that conference. So good morning, everyone, or at least it is for me. My name is Richard Creswick, as Margaret has said. I'm a survivor of Cyclone Tracy and have been invited into this webinar to tell some of my story. My story is just one of 43,000 or more, many more dramatic than mine. I emerged physically uninjured with no deaths in my family. Many others were not so fortunate. I was a journalist with ABC News in December 1974, and my particular job at that time was what's called TV lineup. I was responsible for compiling the 7 p.m. television news bulletin and directing it as it went to air. It's said that Tracy could hardly have come at a worse time. It was party time with the last of the many departmental and business Christmas parties celebrating the end of the year, and of course it was Christmas Eve. Perhaps we felt invincible, or at least blasé, because 3 weeks earlier we'd experienced what was for most of us the first cyclone warning of our lives, with Cyclone Selma, which briefly threatened Darwin, but suddenly reversed course and drifted off to the west. For Selma, we'd done all that we were advised to do, and the anticlimax had left most of us unprepared for what was to come. We'd known of Tracy's existence, if I could bring up the map, for 3 days as it followed a generally southwestern course from where it had formed in the Arafura Sea, several hundred kilometres northeast of Darwin. Its sudden change of course in the early hours of December 24th, Christmas Eve, put it on course for Darwin. At the time, my wife, Patsy, a teacher, was holidaying with a fellow teacher in Bali, leaving me with our 3 cats and a housemate named Eric. As usual, I'd joined my newsroom colleagues for the standard long and boozy lunch at the Don Hotel just across the road from the ABC, returning to work in time to edit a few stories before heading out to another Christmas party at 3 o'clock for another quick beer. As it had been for several days, Cyclone Tracy was to be my lead story. So back at work, I rang the head of the Weather Bureau, Ray Wilkie, for the latest information. Ray asked me not to over-dramatise the situation, so my lead story, while referring to the threat, carried his information that Tracy would cross the coast of Shoal Bay north of Darwin about 5 o'clock in the morning. Having put the bulletin to air at 7 p.m, I headed off to yet another Christmas party, this time at the home of a friend not far from where I lived in Jingley, one of Darwin's newer northern suburbs. Throughout the evening, the winds became progressively stronger, the rain was getting heavier, and there was thunder and lightning. But still, the impression was that this was just another typical wet season storm. I was driving an MGB at the time, and as I drove the short distance home around midnight, strong winds rocked the car, the road was flooded and water was lapping my door sills, but again, not unusual for a wet season storm. Our house was one of the elevated types, essentially a rectangle of fibro cement with a small veranda, kitchen, and full width living dining room occupying half, and the other half comprising bathroom, a separate toilet, and 3 bedrooms. It was all roofed in corrugated iron, and there were many louver windows. Inside the house, it was also typical wet season, hot and humid, so I went to bed wearing just my jocks. Eric came home from the same party and went to bed, also just wearing jocks, though his were in a fancy leopard print. At some point, the power failed. Then Eric woke me to point out a sheet of corrugated roofing iron had come loose, and in the light from the lightning flashes could be seen swaying back and forth outside his bedroom window. That motivated us to heed the cyclone warning advice, so gathering up the 3 cats, we headed into the bathroom, making sure we had a cold 6-pack of beer to see us through the anticipated storm. Eric sat in the bath with the cats, while I sat on the floor with my back to the door because the catch didn't work. After a while, the beers got too warm to drink, but we were getting colder. I suggested getting the bottle of Courvoisier brandy that Eric had bought duty-free a week earlier when he returned from a visit home to his parents in England. To get the brandy involved making my way to the lounge room, where I found the louver windows at both ends were shattered and rain and unidentifiable debris was flying horizontally through the room. I belly crawled to the sideboard and returned to the bathroom with the brandy in hand. Soon afterwards, the bathroom window exploded in, showering the floor with glass. I'd spread towels on the floor in a vain attempt to soak up the rainwater that was pouring from the ceiling. By now, we were both very cold, so I proposed another foray to the bedroom, where I could get us something warm to wear. As I stepped out of the bathroom doorway, the almost constant lightning flashes showed I no longer had any bedrooms. I was looking at an expanse of wet, polished Jarrah floorboards, and beyond that, oblivion. Retreating to the bathroom, it registered that the only barrier between me and what was now the outside world was a very flimsy bathroom door. I needed better protection, so I took off my jocks and tied the doorknob to the towel rail on the wall beside it and moved under the wash basin, thinking it might offer more protection. Within what seemed like seconds, a gust of wind blew the door open, ripping the towel rail off the wall and shredding my jocks. So I resumed my place holding the door shut with my feet against the lip of the shower recess. To preserve my modesty, I wrapped one of the wet, glass-impregnated towels from the floor around me, sarong style. One of the most common memories of survivors is of the noise of the cyclone, and Mike referred to it in that ABC film. It was both deafening and at the same time off the scale of human hearing. I describe it as white noise, which occasionally reduced to a shrill scream when you could hear the crashes and bangs of things hitting the house. At one point, the bathroom ceiling fell in, landing on the hand basin and doorknob, which effectively held the door closed. It meant I could climb into the slightly safer bath with Eric and the cats, where Eric suggested that it might be time for me to teach him the words of Waltzing Matilda. Insofar as I remembered them, I did. By the time it got light enough to see, the wind had eased, and although it was still drizzling, we were able to fold back the ceiling and look out of the bathroom window on a scene of destruction such as we'd never seen before. As has been mentioned by many, Hiroshima came to mind. Almost certainly in a daze, I went to the lounge where I found the ceiling gone, but my Pentax camera still sitting on the corner of a rather massive Dutch cupboard. For some reason, I went back to the bathroom and took 2 photos. That's photographs 1 and 2, looking south through the window. I then went out, you can see, I then went out to where the spare room had been and took 3 more photographs looking north across the road to the houses of some ABC colleagues. Inexplicably, I didn't take a photograph of my own house. We were both really cold by now, so I suggested we go downstairs and get into my car to warm up a bit, though I took one shot through the missing rear window, and that's photograph 6, of Eric in his leopard spotted jocks with an armful of soggy clothes that he'd gathered up from the yard. Not long afterwards, a man appeared, said he was from emergency services, asked if we were okay, advised that the nearby Casuarina High School was an emergency shelter, and then moved on. A short while after that, an ABC colleague from across the road, Dave, came over to ask if we could get his family, which included his 3-week-old daughter and his elderly parents, to the emergency shelter at Casuarina High. Eric's work car was sitting in the driveway virtually undamaged, and it started. So Eric piled in Dave's traumatised family and took them up to Casuarina. While he was away, I fossicked around in the mud below where my bedroom had been, and amazingly, I found the wedding and engagement rings that Patsy had left behind, plus my wallet and car keys. When Eric returned, we decided to seek out the friends whose place we'd partied at the night before, in the hope they might have some dry clothes. We found their house, a low-set housing commission design, virtually undamaged, and yes, they had shorts and a shirt to replace my towel. They could also offer coffee. Although it was Christmas Day, I was rostered to work, which included once again producing the TV news bulletin, and I was becoming conscious that I might be late for work. As mentioned, I had a low-slung MGB, and I'd gone less than 50 metres when debris ripped the exhaust off. I threw it through the missing back window into the passenger seat, and sounding like a tractor, began the journey to work. Normally, it was about a 20-minute drive, but because the roads were so heavily strewn with debris from the destroyed houses, I was forced to drive slowly, mounting curbs, median strips, weaving from one side of the road to the other as I picked my way over the fallen power lines, between sheets of corrugated iron, bent power poles, and through gaps in the incredible landscape of destruction. I think I was the only car on the road. I don't know how long it took to get to the ABC studios, but I remember being surprised when I got into McMinn Street that there was a huge front-end loader already clearing debris from the road. Here, at least, was someone doing their job. Most of the ABC staff had gathered at the studios, the technicians discussing damage and what repairs might be needed to get us back on air, the rest of us like stunned mullets. All I could think of was how on earth was I going to be able to put a news bulletin together that night. At one point, I asked the Chief of Staff, John Milbank, whether he thought I'd have to do that. A laconic bloke, John did a big look around over the devastation and then said, "I don't think so, Richard." My relief was enormous, but it speaks to my state of mind, I think, that I actually asked the question. If you read Major General Alan Stretton's book, The Furious Days, you'll get the impression that he arrived into a city where the demoralised populace desperately needed the help of a self-described dictator who assumed powers he was not sure he had to begin the process of restoring order. Stretton was the head of the very recently formed National Disasters Organisation, which coincidentally, and has been mentioned, and perhaps ironically, had been formed at a meeting in Darwin only a few months earlier. I've already referred to the emergency services bloke who came by our house and the loader driver at work, but the NT's own emergency committee, despite its members having gone through the same experience as the rest of us, was already meeting from quite early on Christmas morning. Schools were already operating as relief centres. Electrical workers were restoring power distribution to places like the hospital and other emergency services, so locals had already begun to get things organised. Meanwhile, back at the ABC, I knew I was in the middle of the biggest story of my life, but I couldn't function as a journalist because I couldn't see the point of reporting if no one could see or hear. The ABC had its own emergency power, and the TV building, having suffered only minor damage, became the focal point of activities. Some of the wives organised meals using a small kitchen and Christmas food rescued from homes. A row of fridges along a corridor wall outside the now superfluous TV studios held food and beer, while the belongings we salvaged were stacked in that studio. The families dossed down where they could for the day or two it took the assistant manager, Don Benstead, to negotiate an Ansett Airlines evacuation flight for women and children. Because of the 3 cats, I chose to go home at night, and that was an unsettling experience. Normally at night, there's a lot of ambient noise, but in those northern suburbs at that time, the nights were eerily quiet, the only sounds being the odd, isolated, distant purrings of small generators. It was easy to imagine that you were the only person alive. I'd salvaged a mattress, pick number 7 if we may, thank you. That's my house, incidentally, 3 bedrooms missing on the right. And if you look closely, you can see a leaning wall, and behind that a window. That's the bathroom where Eric and I stayed. And down below, I've made myself a cubby, a nest under the floorboards with 3 very spooked cats staying close to home. You might wonder why, when police were shooting stray dogs and cats, I invested so much time in keeping our cats alive. It was basically because they were so important to Patsy. I had this perhaps irrational feeling that if they died, I'd have somehow failed her. A day or 2 after the cyclone, by some magic means, I got a telegram from Patsy saying she'd stay in Bali until she was able to return to Darwin. I immediately responded, telling her to go to Perth. A day later, I got another telegram saying she'd wait in Bali until I could join her. As neither of those options were even vaguely likely, I again told her to go to Perth, where we both had family. My telegrams took 10 days to reach her and were the first indication she knew that I was alive. The ABC's technicians did an amazing job, and about 1 p.m. on Boxing Day, announcer Howard Baker declared the ABC back on air by playing the theme from Rush, a television program which was popular at the time. It's an evocative piece of music, and I think all of us sitting outside the studios had tears in our eyes, or in fact were crying as I was. Being back on air meant we could start producing news bulletins again, though these mostly consisted of pronouncements, sorry about that, from Stretton, or information about the cleanup programs being carried out by the Defence Forces and increasing numbers of volunteers arriving from other parts of Australia. In the meantime, my housemate Eric had located friends occupying a relatively undamaged house in Winnellie. One of the people was an electrician named Howie, who had a few other skills, including welding, and was able to do a passable job of reinstalling the MG's exhaust system. Somehow, it was agreed that the 3 of us would drive to Perth, Eric in my MG, Howie in his Corolla, while I would drive a Holden Ute belonging to another of the announcers who came from Perth. We chose to leave about 10 p.m. on New Year's Eve, each of us with one of the cats, hoping that travelling in the relative cool of the night would be best for them. You can see the thinking process was not at their best. Not long into the trip, it became clear that the Holden Ute was going to be a problem because it was using a lot of oil, so that by the time we finally got close to Kununurra the next day, the engine was so close to seizing that I was forced to stop. Eric and Howie, now with the 3 cats, can I have the next pic? Eric and Howie, went on to Kununurra, promising to bring back lots of oil. A few hours later, one of them returned, not only with the promised oil, but news of what was to be the extraordinary generosity of the West Australian Department of Community Services throughout the rest of our journey. Arriving in Kununurra, they'd gone straight to the offices of MMA Airlines and used the last of our combined money to send the cats to my parents in Perth on a flight that night. They had then been directed to an emergency centre for Darwin evacuees, where they were given vouchers for food, accommodation, reimbursed the cost of consigning the cats, and best of all, vouchers for work on our vehicles, which included a full rings and bearings job on the Holden engine. We experienced similar hospitality throughout our trip. I don't know how long it took, but 3 of us parted ways in Geraldton, where Patsy's mother welcomed me in. At 5 o'clock the next morning, the phone rang, and being nearest to it, I answered it. It was Patsy, just arrived from Jakarta at my parents' home in Perth. As you might imagine, and as you could probably hear in my voice, it was an emotional reunion when I drove into Perth, this time in the MG, a few hours later to find her also reunited with the 3 cats. There's a postscript to this story. I'd left Darwin expecting not to return, but Patsy had other ideas. Darwin was not only her home, she needed to see what had happened to her house and sift through the ruins for precious things that I had missed. We returned to Darwin at the end of January. That's a photograph of Patsy, her first inspection of our house. We settled temporarily in a re-roofed flat in Stuart Park, which meant we could get the cats back. 9 months later, we moved to the rural area where we've been ever since. All 3 cats went on to live long and, we think, happy lives. Thank you.
I'm just going to let those clapping hands and the hearts keep going for a little while, Richard. I suspect, like me, a lot of the people listening were spending equal time in that presentation from you with compassion and horror for what you went through, with laughter and shaking of heads about how you've survived and how you tell the story. It is an amazing story. I would encourage people to throw some questions in the chat for any of the speakers. In Andrew's absence, I thank him, and we have Ian and Richard here now, so between us we can have a bit of a conversation with the time that we have left. The first question that's visible, Richard, is for you. So thank you so much for sharing this incredible recollection, which everyone's also saying in the chat. It's an amazing, captivating story. Nell's just wondering about time. She says, I'm sure time is not clearly measurable during such traumatic events, but do you have a sense of how long the most intense part of that cyclone went for? How long you might have been trapped in the bathroom?
It is difficult. I have no idea of time, as I don't think I looked at my watch. If indeed I had a watch at the time, I don't think I looked at it. And I've no idea of what time we actually went into the bathroom. But the interesting thing about cyclones is they start with gentle winds, the outer winds that first hit. And Cyclone Tracy was about 42 kilometres wide, with an eye in the centre of approximately, or between 8 and 12 kilometres. It actually varied between that much. So what happens first is that you get the outer winds, and then gradually builds up until the winds at the wall of the eye hit you, and they are the absolutely demonic winds. Then, if you're lucky, you get the eye. A lot of people didn't. I don't think we had the eye out in where I was in Jingley. And because the eye was quite narrow, there are a lot of parts of both the city and the northern suburbs which missed out on the eye. So those who had the eye have this calm period where they could actually look up and see the stars, and then all of a sudden the wind is back, redoubled, as furious as it was when it left them. There's no build up. It's just instant chaos, and everybody talks about it coming back even stronger. As for time, there's a mention of 6 or 7 hours. I certainly think that Eric and I and the 3 cats were in the bathroom for at least 4 hours, at least 4.
Yeah,
I hope that answers that question.
it does. Thank you. And your regular references to the cats, and I'm so pleased, as I'm sure everybody is, to learn that they lived long and happy lives after that event. But AIDR has, in the latter part of 2024, released a book on animals in disasters, because as you described, they're just so important to people. So we're still learning about what more we can do about looking after our animals. A couple more questions here, and Ian, just sit quiet because everyone's riveted by Richard's story. So you may get
I'm
away
sorry, Ian.
scot-free. So Carolyn says, I was surprised by your journey and was on a knife's edge that the access road past Catherine would have been flooded and cut off. Did you encounter any flooding?
No.
So interesting.
Indeed. There was a very heavy rainfall during the cyclone. I think equivalent of 11 inches fell. And in a couple of the photographs, you can see that at dawn, there was still a sea in the backyards. But it's interesting, Darwin disperses its water really quickly. So flooding in Darwin is usually quite temporary. Now down the track, well, the other thing was that it's my belief, from the fact that I was able to spend nights under my floorboards without getting wet, that Cyclone Tracy took the weather with it. And in the period immediately after the cyclone, we had a period of quite fine weather. So I didn't experience any flooding. There was no impediment to us travelling at all a week after the cyclone.
Very interesting that it took the weather with it. Would you say, and I might throw this question to both of you, would either of you or both of you say that the general public are more or less resilient than they might have been 50 years ago, should something like this happen today? Certainly we'd have more communication options.
Absolutely. I think 50 years ago, people were much more resourceful. I think my own feeling is that we're a pampered citizenry now, and there are still people who like to go bush and do all of those things. But as a society, living much more comfortably with air conditioning and all of the services and streaming and all that sort of stuff, I just think we're not as resilient as we would have been.
Yeah. Any view, Ian? Oh, you're on mute, Ian.
Thanks, Margaret. Great question. As Richard said, that's from there to now, going through Northern Territory Emergency Service runs and conducts quite a number of cyclone webinars and warnings and meetings for the communities and the publics. Going out to a lot of schools, a lot of workplaces in Darwin and the suburbs there, informing people of the risks of cyclone, what actions to take before, during and after, so that education process. We have also implemented, along with Australia-wide now, after a number of events, the Australian warning system. And one of our hazards, Northern Territory Emergency Service hazards, is tropical cyclone, as you're aware of, and we do have the Australian warning system for that. So we will put out advice, watch and act, and emergency warnings. And we did for last season, we implemented it November 1, 2023. And we had a number of cyclones or weather events that did occur over the last tropical or high-risk weather season that we utilised Australian warning system, similar to our neighbours in Queensland and Western Australia. So we're now working together with the Australian Tropical Cyclone Action Group, with the Bureau of Meteorology, as that committee working together. So we're all working to get that message out. And when the cyclone does cross or very close to borders, we're very much in that communication phase together to get that messaging out to community. But as Richard said, it will be a test of times as to see how people react and how people become resilient. And we're still pushing that first 72 hours that you need to be resilient for yourself and fend for yourself, have that home emergency kit, have that stockpile of food and water, batteries and everything else. So it's getting that message out, but we'll see how it goes when the event occurs.
Thanks, Ian. Look, that is all we have time for today, and I thank everybody for attending the webinar. There's a lot of feedback, Richard, about how wonderful your story is and what an inspiration it has been to listen to. So we thank you for that. Look, before you all leave us, we'd love you to fill out a short survey. We'll email it to you shortly. We do use this information to shape our professional program of events. So please do fill that out when you get it. On behalf of Northern Territory Emergency Services, Australian Red Cross and AIDR, I thank everybody for attending, and a particular thank you to Richard and Ian for presenting. It's been my pleasure to host you for what is our final webinar for 2024. I wish you all a happy and safe Christmas, and we'll see you all next year.